Welcome to Aircrew Interview. I'm Mike, your host, and this is part one of our interview with Chris Bunky Marlar. In this episode, Chris chats about his time on the C-2 Greyhound and also being an instructor on the T-45 Goshawk. If you enjoy our videos and podcasts and would like to support the channel, you can do this by helping us out monthly at patreon.com/aircrew interview, which allows us to continue to create new content every month and grow as a channel. Thank you and enjoy. So, Chris, how did you become interested in aviation?
I think the first time I guess I was too young to remember, but I know my father, he was stationed in San Diego. He was a corpsman, United States Navy, and we lived right near the airport in near Lindbergh Field. And so he said when I was a kid, he would take me down to watch airplanes land because that's what I wanted to do. So when I, as I got old enough to remember and I was growing up, I just absolutely loved aircraft. And in 1983, my father took me to Point Mugu Air Show, NAS Point Mugu. And I remember seeing the Blue Angels, A4s, and that, and I thought, well, that's what I want to do.
So what year did you actually join the Navy?
I was commissioned in March of 1993, or April 1st of 1993. But I went through 4 years of ROTC, UCLA, and ROTC. And then I got my commission, and there was a delay for flight school. I've been accepted to Navy flight school, and there was about an 8-month delay. So in between, I actually got stashed at Top Gun in San Diego, and I was the public affairs officer for about 8 months, and then I went off to API in November, December of 1993.
Awesome. So could you tell us some of the aircraft you started training on?
So I flew 3 aircraft. So when I selected, I was flying a VT-27, flying the T-34C Mentor. At the time, the Navy's primary basic trainer. I guess now it's the T-6 Texan 2. And then I selected E2C2. I went to T-44s, VT-31 in Corpus Christi. And then I finished up with VT-4 in Pensacola, Florida, NAS Pensacola, Florida. We were the kind of like the final advanced E2C2 squadron, and they ended up transitioning to NFO training after my class. But I flew the T2C Buckeye for my advanced training. And I CQ'd on the USS Kitty Hawk in July of '96, and they got my wing in the same month.
So I asked this to all our Navy guests. Did you have an aircraft you wanted to go onto at this time, and did you eventually get it?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I wanted to fly jets, and, Navy's needs come first. And we had a pretty big class, or I say class, my class, but we had 5 squadrons, 5 primary squadrons. You compete with everyone. And I finished somewhere maybe near top of the middle. I think I was number 6 out of 15, around that. And there were, as I recall, there were maybe 5 jet slots and 2 E2C2 slots. And so I ended up getting E2C2. Now, I did put it down my second choice because I felt, as a naval aviator, I wanted to fly off aircraft carriers. So I'm like, okay, jet E2. And then maybe I put P3s or something third. So that's what I got. So I wanted to fly Hornets, but, Navy's needs. And then you always hear this. You're like, you'll end up liking what you fly. And I don't know if you end up liking what you fly. The C-2 was a difficult plane to fly, but, you grow accustomed to it. And it's a good life when I was a cockpit pilot.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about the C-2. What were your first thoughts of the aircraft?
So I remember when I was a student, I was just about, I was probably, a month from getting winged, and VAW 120, which was at the time which still is, I think it's called something different now, but it was the FRS, the Fleet Replacement Squadron. They flew an E2C2 down. So we got to go sit in the cockpit, and I remember, I'm going from the T2, which is a very basic jet trainer, had a big, single gyro. I think we had a TACAN and a 1 UHF radio, and 9 annunciator lights. I think it was 9, and they look like Legos, very basic, but it was a fun jet. So I go inside the E2 and I go inside the C2, and there's a big cockpit, and you've now got a wheel. And I was a bit depressed. Well, one, the E2 C2 aren't exactly the most beautiful aircraft in the Navy's inventory. And I thought, man, it's big prop aircraft, kind of ugly. Bless you. And so that was probably, the first time I said, wow, I don't know if I'm going to like this. And just, the looks and the big cockpit. In the end, I did enjoy flying it. It was a tough aircraft to fly. But at first, it was a bit overwhelming based on looks. And, I was used to flying around that little jet trainer, and now I'm going to fly around this big, kind of sluggish aircraft.
Yeah. So what was actually the role of the C-2?
So the C-2, well, when I got to the RAG, you can put down E2 or C-2. Which do you want? I wanted to go West Coast more than anything. I was from California, so I wanted to fly either E2 or C-2. Top two guys got E2s, and then they had a C-2 slot, so I ended up taking that one. So the role of the C-2 is carrier onboard delivery, logistics, and you're performing what I like to tell people. Sometimes they ask, they go, hey, what is that? And I said, they didn't know what it is. I said, you know what a C-130 is? Like a Marine Corps basic C-130, Air Force C-130, and that's what we do, but we do it from the aircraft carrier. So we would drop people, VIPs, sailors going out to the boat. We would, of course, bring supplies, and we also did paradrops with Navy SEALs.
No, right, I didn't know that. Right.
Yeah, that was probably generally just in practice, vice in real-world situations. I mean, the C-2 has no defensive capabilities, no raw gear, no flares. So, I mean, if it did it for real life, it'd have to be very, very low threat or almost no threat. I flew King Airs with the ISR L3 contract later on. You know, we flew in a low-threat environment, and even that had flares. So the C-2 had no protective gear whatsoever. Wow. But we did practice. We did fly low levels. I did even halo jumps in Navy SEALs out of the C-2.
Awesome. So, Chris, how many hours did you get on the C-2, and what did you do after this?
I got about 1,700 hours on the C-2. I did 3 tours. I was VRC 30 twice, and then I did an instructor tour of VW 120. And once I was finished with my second C tour, I wanted to continue flying, and I was looking for orders, and I got this email one day from the detailer and said, hey, we got this billet in Whiting Field, and it's NETSAPA, and I think NETSAPA is Naval Education Training, Security, and Field Activity. I believe that's what it is. Correct. Is it? Okay. All right. And I know we just said NETSAPA. I never heard of it, and I called the pilot who was there, and he's like, dude, you want to come here? You're your own boss. And now at the time, so NETSAPA trains foreign, not just foreign pilots. It trains, we train guys in all foreign military in all aspects of the military. Now in Pensacola, obviously it was pilots, naval flight officers, and we also had guys who were being trained by a retired Navy SEAL, preparing them for buds. And primarily it was the Royal Saudi Navy. So I went to Whiting, and it was basically a prep school for Royal Saudi Navy pilots. And we would, I had 3 civilian guys who were all retired military pilots, and they would go through prep classes. So we would prep them for each phase of training. And I flew with VT6 and primary instructor in the T-35C. I didn't get many hours. It just how it worked out was how VT6 flew what we were called associate pilots. We weren't part of the squadron or wing. So maybe at most 3 times a week I might get a flight. But most of my time was dealing with the Saudi students, making sure that they were prepped. They tended sometimes to get in trouble a little bit, and I dealt with that. But we had some really fantastic Saudi students and some not so much. But it was a great tour, and I got about 400 hours as an instructor in T-34.
So what was it like working with a different nation? Did the language barrier come in quite a lot there?
It does, and so that's the one thing I kind of learned was even later on in Kingsville, I'm going to fly around with foreign pilots. The biggest barrier to flying was the language barrier. We had a very strong Saudi student, and we said he spoke the King's English. He actually went to high school in the United States. He went back to Saudi, went to their Naval Academy. He comes back, and he does very well. And the thing is, he had the English language down perfect, So, for example, later on, we flew with I thought some of the best students I ever flew with in T-45s were the Portuguese. Now, it's Brazilian. They spoke Portuguese. And initially, it was tough for them because my understanding is they didn't go to language school. So when you were flying basic flights, maybe instrument flights, the controller says something, and now he's got to take that English, Portuguese, translate it, now spit it out in English, right? Mm-hmm. But once they got it down, the improvement in flying was always the case for all the foreign pilots. So that, I think, was the biggest factor in determining a successful foreign pilot, whose primary language was something other than English.
Yeah. And before we get onto the lovely T-45, you also had a non-flying job after this. Could you tell us briefly what happened here?
when that tour was over, the Navy came to me and said, "Hey, you can have whatever you want if you go to, on an IA to Iraq, Afghanistan." I wanted to see. I said, "Roger that. I'll take it." I have a bad back. I had blown out disc and I went for a physical. And Navy flight physical is different than an Army physical when you're gonna, haul stuff on your back, and they wouldn't allow me to go. So I had to find other orders. So I ended up going to Korea for a year, and it was as the executive officer of Military Sea Lift Command Office Korea. And basically that office, what it did was control logistics in and out of Korea. But the primary thing was if there were a Korean War II, the evacuation of non-combatant evacuees. And we would do that from Busan. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what we trained for and prepared for. But there was no flying involved. It was just a desk job.
Mm-hmm. And did you enjoy that position?
I did. I mean, I missed flying because I like flying. That's just what I wanted to do. But it was fun. I lived in a city called Yeongho-dong, and I lived in this great big apartment on like the 15th floor. Had a great time. The food was great. The people were great. Partying, drinking was great. So it was really a fun tour. At first you go in, you're like, "Oh, this is going to be awful." Ended up being fantastic. So, but because the Navy said, "Hey, you could, if you go to Iraq, Afghanistan," ended up I couldn't go because of my physical back issues. I went to Korea, and so they kept their word, and I got orders to NAS Kingsville, the T-45 Goshawk, which is what I've been trying to get for a long time. I actually had orders years ago to go to Meridian to fly with VT9. They were flying T2s at the time because I'd flown that. And they got pulled, and I went to VW20 as a C-2 instructor. So after that, I got sent to Kingsville.
Yeah, so what were your first thoughts of the T-45 Goshawk? Because it is a beautiful aircraft.
Yeah, I think so, too. I mean, I'll say of the aircraft I flew in the Navy, T-45 was hands down the most fun. Obviously, it's comes from I think the Hawk 60 series maybe from the British Hawk. It's just for me it's a sexy aircraft. Again, I'm going from C2, but even if I didn't fly the C2, I think it's just a fantastic looking jet. So I was very excited. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go fly that in the training environment. And I was very, very happy. And the first time you see it, it's somewhat of a small jet. And it's interesting how you sit in the jet. That was the first thing that when I first sat in it, it kind of has that angled cockpit. So when you're in the back, you really you have pretty good vision. You can see kind of over the student pilot's helmet somewhat, and looking down there. But it's also, the one thing is I'm a pretty big guy. I'm 6 foot, 225 pounds. Big broad shoulders, and sitting in the Goshawk for the first time was interesting because as I get in, you've got standard, you got your harness, your G suit harness, SV2. So I get in this cockpit, and it is literally, it's not like A4 small, but I get in the thing, and I just can't move. So when the canopy closes, I mean, you're really strapping the jet on. And I wasn't the biggest guy to be in the T-45 by any means. There were a couple of guys much bigger than me. Mm-hmm. You just didn't have much room. But once you got used to it, it wasn't bad. It was a fantastic aircraft to fly, in my opinion.
Yeah, because you mentioned in your bio you sent over to me that you flew the A and the C model. What was the difference?
So the A model was, I got about 25 hours in the A model, and it was all analog. And the HUD really wasn't a true HUD. I don't ever remember even using the HUD. I got about 800 hours in the T-45. I just don't remember using the HUD in the A model. So you had a 6-pack of instruments, your ITT gauge, all that stuff. And it was on the opposite side of the Charlie. And I remember I went through the sims, and almost all were T-45As. I think I had one Charlie. And then when my first flight T-45 was in the Charlie model. So my scan just was not there. So it's my first NATOPS flight, and I get in the Charlie, and we take off. And I think we had a level at maybe, 2,500 feet or something, and I'm accelerating. I had no scan, so I don't know really, I'm looking around the cockpit, I'm like, I barely got this thing started. And I had a pilot in the back, I think his call sign was Notso, great guy, but he didn't say much. And he didn't say anything to me. And all I hear him say is, watch your airspeed. And I look out, we're straight and level, I'm like at 430 knots, accelerating. T-45 was a bit underpowered, but it was very clean. It's a very clean jet. So once you got the speed, they're supposed to maintain that, I think maybe 250 climbing out until we get above 10, obviously. But he didn't say a word. and I just didn't know where to look on the HUD. I kid you not, to find the airspeed. And down here, because my scan was mostly towards the Alpha model. But once we got into training, there's 20 flights in the instructor syllabus, almost all with the T-45 Charlie.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on to you learning to fly the aircraft and going on to be an instructor, was it unusual for a C-2 pilot to go on to instruct T-45s pilots?
Okay, so about 80% of the squadrons are jet guys. You got Hornet, Harry guys, some Tomcat guys, and then the other 20% are going to be Prowler, S3, and then E2, C2. So we have a contingent of Hawkeye and COD guys. The thing for me that was difficult was that I hadn't flown a jet in 14 years. So I've been flying props, flying T-34s, a lot of aerobatics, but not the same. T-34 is a very slow aircraft. You'd be lucky to get 190 knots straight level on the thing. I mean, just not a, high performance aircraft. So I get there and they have a syllabus. It's 20 flights, and it's definitely set up for the Harrier or Hornet pod out of the fleet. Because what do? They do everything that's in the syllabus. From the 2-plane, 4-plane, cruise form, which is, you're offset, you're going over the top doing aerobatics. And about probably the 6th or 7th flight in, I remember telling my wife, I said, I think I made a mistake, because I felt like I was holding on to the slats the whole time. Just kind of 14 years had gone by and I wasn't used to flying. And I'm not saying it was that fast, but it was just a dynamic environment. You're flying an aircraft a lot more dynamically than you are a straight and level, C2. And even though I did hundreds of spins in the T-34, I say hundreds, probably 200-300 spins, because the syllabus that I was doing, still just doesn't prepare you being a slow prop guy and then going to a faster jet.
So let's talk some about your ground training and flying training to become an instructor. First of all, do they already know you're going to be a good instructor, or do you have to pass a certain course on the ground and in the air before you can move on?
No, at the time, we just had instructor training unit. I think it was called ITU. And so you would come into the wing, and then you would just simply go through the standard ground course. You had students in there. So that was going through systems and things like that. And then they just throw you in the fire. I mean, it was sink or swim. So I think the first 5 flights were in NATOPS, and then you got a check ride, and then you go into a syllabus where you're flying hops to prepare you for at least the intermediate phase and some advanced phase flying in the syllabus. So I think the Air Force has like a FIT unit or something like, or PIT, I think. Perhaps it's PIT, something like that, where they actually send instructors and they do a certain amount of time learning how to be an instructor. We just learn to fly the aircraft, and then you're on your own. And then whether, you can be good, you can be bad, or a little bit of both.
So let's talk a bit about the aircraft itself. So what did it do well and what did it not do so well?
So unfortunately, I can't compare it to an F-18 or a Harrier. I mean, obviously, it was slower than those jets, not quite as high performance. But the one thing I thought it did really well was that it was very docile. It was very forgiving. So I remember we would do like OCF flights, and we would go up and, put the aircraft in a certain, nose up 70 degrees, and then let it get to 180 knots, and then we would neutral idle the controls, and you just kind of, maybe 5 to 10 units angle tack and, let the nose fall over, or we'd go up to 110 degrees nose up. And you kind of had to hold it there. So you had some floating negative G on the aircraft. And then when the airspeed would get certain, neutral idle, and the aircraft would just sit there and just kind of nicely fall over. I mean, nothing very aggressive, nothing to scare you. There was a certain part of the aircraft that you had to be worried about, and that was 9 degrees nose up, plus or minus maybe 10 degrees, and 0 airspeed. Because what would happen is the rudder would fully deflect. Now you would depart. And if you did that, it generally would go into an inverted spin. And if you're inverted spin, you probably weren't going to get out of that. It took about, as I recall, maybe 360 foot-pounds of force to get the rudder over. And so all the inverted all the aircraft, all the guys I knew who got into one or knew of, they all had to punch because the aircraft wouldn't recover.
Wow. So the cockpit, what was it essentially the front cockpit where the student sits with, I guess, was it the same as where you were in the back instructing?
It was. I didn't have a HUD in the back. So I didn't have that. And believe me, after a while, when I became a 4-plane, 2-plane lead, night form lead, did all that stuff, and I flew a lot of solo flights, you become what we call a HUD cripple. I mean, everything I needed was on that HUD. So you had the HUD, you had its box where you could program stuff in. You had your 2 CRT screens. I'm not sure if they were real CRT screens, but they looked like it. So when I was in the back, generally if the student was in the front, fan flight, maybe he was on a, form flight, TAC form, something like that. He would have, I could bring up his HUD if it worked. I could actually bring up a picture of his HUD so I could kind of see what was going on. Didn't always work that way. So that was the biggest difference. And sometimes during fan flights, for example, so in the familiarization phase, they're learning how to fly the jet. We're doing aerobatics, stalls. And then, of course, when they start coming back, we start training them how to fly the ball. I thought it was a bit difficult to fly the ball from the back seat, just the angle you were sitting. Generally, when I got close, the ball would drop. So you're trying to show them, hey, here's how it's done, just from where you were sitting. Sometimes at the very end, the ball would drop off. So you fly it, then it drop off. You're like, you want to do it right up to that point. You want to keep the ball centered.
So you mentioned the kind of syllabus there. Can you tell us what you actually trained the students on? Was there, did it go from basic handling characteristics right up to just before they went onto the frontline jet?
Yeah, so how it worked is you had an intermediate syllabus, and all jet got, okay, so at the time, things were a bit different than when I went through, and I think they've gone back to the old way. When I selected, you were selected a primary jets or E2C2. They had changed at the point where you would just select jets, and then somewhere in the syllabus, we would have a board and guys would go veer off E2C2 or fast jets, okay? Yeah. So we'd always start off what would be the intermediate jet syllabus. So basic instruments, I think, were first. And then maybe some RIs, radio instruments, and then we go to the, I think we call it maybe the contact phase, but aircraft familiarization. And that's where they're really learning. That's when they would sit up front and learn how to fly the jets. Putting G's on the aircraft. We would do aerobatic. I forget what it was called. We'd go into like a loop. What was it called? I think it was a loop, and then we go into, I forget what it's called. You go like 3/4 of the loop, roll out, Immelman, and then to a split S. So we're just teaching them how to fly the aircraft, look outside, maintain your energy, maintain angle of attack. Anytime you went to a loop, it was a 4G pull up to, then we fly angle attack over the top. I think it was 17 units. On speed for the T-45 was 17 units, angle attack. E2C2 was 20 units, for example. I think the T2 was 20 units, just a unit measurement. So we're teaching them basically how to get comfortable on the jet. From there, they might go back to more instruments where they sit in the back seat. Some of them, they would sit in the front for advanced instruments. And then you would start on baby forms. That's what we call them 2-plane forms. So you teach them how to fly formation in 2 planes. Very basic formation flying, teach them how to take off, join up, go out, and then we'll do turns, have them cross under sort of thing. I've got my T-45 models in the back. Those somehow ended up in my house when I retired. I don't know, how they. Yeah, it just happens. But that's what we used to use. Showing them how to do that, and then we do what's called break-up rendezvous, where we kiss them off, we break 180 degrees, they follow, and then we start a turn and have them join. And then we go to cruise forms, which is over the top, sort of aerobatic. We do barrel rolls, barrel rolls, and wing overs, that sort of thing. And then we would do column form, as if they were tanking, and we would do the same thing. Then we would do tail chase, which is always fun. 4-plane form, night formation. And if guys were to make it into the tactical phase, or select Hornets, Harriers, F-35s, I guess nowadays, then they would go into TAC forms, and then on to things like BFM, air to ground, low-level navs, and then, of course, then there's the boat.
Yes, because the boat has fascinated me. Being in the back, were you not terrified with a student pilot in the front, not having any controls, essentially?
Well, I would be, but we don't go. Nobody sits in the back seat when students go out the boat. You're by yourself.
Oh, really?
Because there's no way I would ride in the back seat.
Oh, right. Didn't know that. Okay. Yeah.
We're always by ourselves. Yeah. Now, we may be in the back seat if we're riding with an instructor, absolutely. But as far as going out there, students are solo for their trips to the boat.
Wow. And you mentioned, I think, BFM. We maybe call it DACT. Did you ever conduct that against other types, or was it always Goshawk versus Goshawk if you did something like that?
Now, basically, it was always Goshawk. They had a syllabus, and the reason I got to do some BFM was we had a mishap. We had a couple mishaps. I was there. Luckily, they all got out, and I had to do the JAG investigation on two particular mishaps. One was just took off in a section form together, and then they lost their engine and they punched. The other was a 1v1, and the aircraft departed flight, inverted spin, and they ejected. Well, I was assigned as the JAG officer for that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I thought, God, guy, I don't get to do this stuff. So I went to my boss, the Commodore, and I convinced him, you know, so, sir, look, I can't do this unless I understand BFM. And he looked at me, was like, all right, Bunky, So he allowed me, I could jump in. I jumped in, I think I ended up doing like 16 or 18 BFM hops. I would just jump in the back or the front. A lot of times the instructors let me fly, you know, so I did a lot of reading and stuff. So I got to do mostly 1v1. I rode into some, you know, 1v2 flights or 2v1, however you want to call it. So, but it was almost always T-45s. I do know of a few cases where instructors went up maybe to Fallon and they did dissimilar stuff against maybe, you know, the Top Gun INSOC aircraft maybe. I've heard of that.